will now come to order. We'll start by requesting public comment on any items not on today's agenda. Mr. Bartlett.
Bruce Bartlett from the Planning Commission, and I'm here today just to speak briefly about the Planning Commission stipend consideration that has been on some of the different budget discussions. And I just wanted to represent the sort of senior portion of the Planning Commission, those of us that have been on. This is my 4th year. There's others that have got more years than myself. But Planning Commission has, over the years, always had a stipend, token at best, but at least it represented some degree of acknowledgement for the involvement and the high level of participation and expertise required to be on Planning Commission. In 2007, the other boards and commissions were granted stipends prior to that. They did not have stipends. I was on ABR prior to that. You know, we didn't expect stipends, but obviously when the city was feeling flush, stipends were handed out for all boards and commissions. The beginning of this year, all stipends were eliminated, and I think that Planning Commission is in a different boat, especially because of our degree of time, homework, commitment, site visits, and the fact that almost all of our meetings and subcommittee meetings happen during the day, during the week. ABR and other committees, a lot of it is late in the afternoon, goes into the evening. That's your own time. But the amount of time that we give up during the day, not to mention the homework that we do, you know, at nights and weekends, is substantial. And my concern is the future makeup of Planning Commission if there is not some recognition for the level of involvement and expertise involved with that position. I had to train literally for 3 or 4 years in other committees to get myself up to the level to even be considered for Planning Commission. And my concern is that the voters want representation that really represents the community. They don't want committees or city councils that are made up of wealthy retired people, because those are the only ones that can afford to be involved. So due to the makeup of the Planning Commission in the future, I would hope that you would perhaps reconsider the token stipend. I mean, I think even when we were doing all our meetings throughout the year, it amounted to less than $10,000 a year. And I know that, you know, city council members, you know, you get car allowances and all the other things. We're not asking for any of that, but also you have furlough Fridays when you're not really even using your personal car, so a 10% reduction in the auto allowance would practically pay for the entire Planning Commission stipend. But I just want you to put it in perspective. We've taken 100% hit. We're not represented by unions, and that I think whatever hits are happening should be shared by all. And we're proud of this community, and that's why we do it. It's not about the money, but it's about some level of acknowledgement for our involvement, and I hope that you would at least recognize that. And I thank you for your participation too. So thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Bartlett. Mr. Williams. Judy?
Hi. Well, a little bit of history, folks. When I first started serving on the Planning Commission, there was no stipend. And I took off my expenses a charitable deduction to the city of Santa Barbara. I was audited. And I went to the city council and I said, if you pay $1 to the Planning Commission, that is enough to allow us to take off our expenses as business expenses. And that was the original starting of the stipend for the Planning Commission. You're looking at the nasty old lady who did it. We survived on the one. We took it off as a business expense, and I think that should be something that should be considered in the formula. There is a lot of time that you spend as a planning commissioner, I know. But I also know that you need to get a broad segment of the community, whether they're retired, active, whatever. You need to have representation of the community. And it is important that there be some form of reimbursement. But the dollar allows the people to take it off as a business expense on taxes, and that is a consideration you should make.
Any other public comment? Commissioner Schwartz.
Thank you. Good morning, committee members. I'm following up on Chair Bartlett's comments, and to expand a bit on that, I'm here both to express a long-term concern for the diversity of planning commissioner applicants who might want to seek appointment. Because as Chair Bartlett mentioned, if it falls only to those who financially can afford to sacrifice full days and possibly up to 12, 15 hours a week during the day to commit to the city, to give back to the city, that's going to greatly limit the types of applicants who can serve on this commission, and it is very time consuming. As a newer commissioner, I feel I have a fresh perspective on all that's required between the standing meetings, our liaison subcommittee meetings, the site visits, and all the reading, especially in a year of Plan Santa Barbara. Right now, on average, it's taking us 20 hours a week of our personal and professional time. So if perhaps this fiscal year is not feasible for you to consider it, we at least wanted to come before you to begin considering how to show true valuation of the commissioners at an appropriate time. And perhaps there is another creative way to express recognition that's within the city's financial means, that would be meaningful back to the commissioners, perhaps advantageous from a tax filing perspective, as was mentioned. So any creative and I would say empathetic consideration you could give is greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Schwartz. Any other public comment? Seeing none, we'll begin the presentation. Mr. Samario.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Bob Samario, Interim Finance Director, and as you see, we have a pretty full agenda today. We are scheduled to go all the way up till almost 2 o'clock, about 1:40, and one just to ask the committee really how we want to arrange sort of to break for lunch. And I also understand Mr. Williams may need to leave a little early. I'm not sure if that's how that plays into it, but just really wanted to ask your direction on how you wanted to handle lunch break. We were thinking maybe break at 12 for about 15, 20 minutes.
I think we should just go straight through and then get it done. That's, you know,
okay.
Generally the feedback I've gotten in past committee hearings from Mr. Francisco. Is that still what we want to get done?
I would absolutely like to get it finished. I hope we can get through the entire agenda, but I also think it's rational to allow a little bit of time between this meeting and the city council meeting so people can grab something to eat. So that let's make sure that we have at least 20 minutes.
Okay. Well, I'll take that under advisement for the next hearing, but this one we're going to go straight through. Okay.
Perfect. Okay. And so with that, we have two big items on the agenda, but the first is not related to the budget. It's the investment report for the quarter ended March 31st, 2010, and I'm going to turn it over to Jill Tarr, our Treasury Manager, to give that report.
Good morning, Chair Williams and committee members. My name is Jill Tarr. I'm Treasury Manager, and I'm here to present the Investment and Fiscal Agent Report for the quarter ended March 31st, 2010. As a quarter-end report, I'll present to you some of the key economic events during the quarter and walk you through the city's investment activity January through March. The national economy continued to exhibit mixed signs of recovery, indicating that the recovery will be gradual and both slow. The National Bureau of Economic Research, which is the formal research organization that determines official business cycles for the nation, said that despite positive growth in the economy, a formal determination that the recession has ended based on current data would be premature. So we still formally sit in recession nationally. CPI, which is a general measure of inflation showing the average change in household goods and services over time, remained basically flat in March at 0.1% growth. And national unemployment in March was still very high at 9.7%. The Federal Reserve Bank at its March meeting eyeing high unemployment levels and the low threat of inflation left the federal funds rates again unchanged at the historically low target of 0.25%. And economists expect the Federal Reserve not to increase rates until no sooner than November of 2010, pushing out that forecast, and said probably not until unemployment eases a bit. Despite many people being out of work, retail sales for March were up 1.6%, and industrial production in February grew 0.1% as businesses began building their inventories. All major financial markets posted double-digit gains during the quarter, and the Dow Jones and NASDAQ both posted strongest quarters since 1999 and 1998, respectively. So it was a really strong quarter in the market. However, consumer confidence levels remained low. We'll look at the Treasury yields now, as found on page 2 of the Council Agenda Report. And as you can see in the table, Bob's zooming in there, the short-term rates posted just small gains, but you can see the 1-year to 10-year Treasury yields decreased by 6 to 12 basis points over the quarter as investors continued to demand safety of Treasuries due to uncertainty still nationally in the economy due to the federal government phasing out its special lending programs. It also, on March 31st, ceased buying back distressed mortgage-backed securities, as well as investors remained uncertain over the impact of the $1.75 trillion budget deficit that was announced in March, as well as the high price tag of Obama's Health Care Reform Act, which was signed in March. Economists remain sharply divided on the direction of Treasury yields over the next year, so no one's looking glass is very clear right now. Turning to the city's investment activity during the quarter, you'll see on page 3 of the agenda report is a table showing the investment activity. We had $18 million in purchases during the quarter of AAA-rated federal agency securities. $11 million of the securities were callable securities, and $7 million were federal agency bullets, which means they cannot be called before the maturity date. You'll see in the center section the calls during the quarter. $12 million in federal agencies were called, and we had several maturities during the period, including 2 of our corporate medium-term notes, the Berkshire Hathaway Financial and the Toyota Motor Credit Corp notes, which were matured during the period. If you look on page 4 of the agenda report, there's an investment yield table. Here, Bob, use the big one. And as the table shows, you can see that the city's portfolio continued to outperform our 3 benchmark measures over the quarter. At quarter end, the yield, or the book rate of return on the city's portfolio, was 2.538. That's the top line shown in the table. The next highest yield far below that is the 2-year Treasury, which yielded 1.02 at quarter end. LAIF earned an average of 0.75 during the quarter, and the 90-day T-bill, for reference, was at 0.15% return. The next table I'll put up shows our investment income on the city's portfolio during the quarter. As you can see, the interest on the pooled investments on the securities totaled just over $1 million total. We had amortization of $7,000 and interest on our bank accounts, which was nearly negligible at $334, for total on the city's pooled investments of $1,019,765. Over the quarter, the interest earned on the cash balance held up at LAIF on behalf of RDA was $36,553 for total interest income for the quarter at $1.06 million. We'll turn to page 2 of the attachment of the investment report, and I just wanted to walk through the balances of the city's portfolio at the end of the quarter. As you can see, at the top part of the attachment shows the ending balance at the end of February. The total cash and investments held in the city's portfolio totaled $165.4 million. The total cash and investments at the end of March totaled $162.7 million, and that was comprised of $44,000 held up at the state LAIF money market account. That's both the city and RDA balance. The portfolio held 2 certificates of deposit, $2 million each at Montecito Bank and Trust. There were almost $97 million in federal agency issues. Those are AAA rated agencies that we hold. And the corporate medium-term notes left in the city's portfolio total $6 million. The outstanding balance on the long-term Santa Barbara Airport promissory note totaled $7.2 million, and we held $4.5 million in our cash account at Santa Barbara Bank and Trust for operations. And that concludes my investment report. I just wanted to note that on page 3 of the attachment shows the balances of bond funds held at the fiscal or at the trustee banks, and we're required just to provide that to you each quarter.
Are there questions from the committee members? I have a question. I guess the conventional wisdom might lead you to believe that it would be time to be putting less in extremely liquid, low yield things like LAIF and more in cautiously longer or better interest rate investments. Is that something that is not advisable because of cash flow, or is that something that you're already proceeding on doing right now?
That's a good question, Chair Williams, because the LAIF balance at the end of March showed $44 million sitting very liquid, earning roughly 0.57%. The bulk of that there is RDA cash, and that needs to be available for the capital projects as they're spending as well as their daily operations. I think we have only about $17 million for the rest of the city sitting at LAIF, which we try and keep it between $15 and $20 million to make sure we have enough for our cash needs. So while it shows a large amount at the end of March, actually the amount available for all city operations is far less.
Okay. So I guess I would just say I would still say it's something that we should think about. It's pretty disappointing to keep on seeing that low graph on LAIF and know that we have $44 million sitting, being that inactive. And I know obviously that much of that is RDA, and we cannot lock it away. But it is still, I cringe every time I see that amount. So
Yes.
Something to think about.
Yes.
Thanks. Okay, are we doing the general fund balancing strategy or the departmental fees first?
We're going to start with the balancing strategy first, if you don't mind, and then we'll follow with a look at our non-departmental revenues or taxes, essentially, and we've gone over those in a lot of detail over the last several months, but Jill Tara will go over that and spend a few minutes on that as well, just to kind of help frame some of the discussion. And then we will move on to the Community Development Department, who will present their fees, their proposed fee changes for next year. And then we'll wrap up with a discussion of our streets program revenues.
Great.
So this is something that you've seen already. It was in our budget message. It was in our presentations we gave to the City Council recently. But we thought we'd just start with this, again, just to kind of prevent, for the benefit of the public, to frame some of the discussion at least, and to review kind of what our problem was and how we propose to address it. I would say back in December timeframe, January timeframe, when we did our forecast for the next year, we had identified a projected budget gap of about $8.9 million. Since then, we have some measures that we're proposing. Some of them are actually newly identified funding sources. There are two there that we've talked about. The first is a reduction in self-insurance charges. Those are the charges that are from our self-insurance trust fund for workers' compensation and liability programs. And we have, I think, done a much better job in trying to establish charges that are more consistent with what we've actually had to pay over the last several years. Generally speaking, we determine those charges or calculate those charges based on a report provided to us every few years by our actuaries, and they say that they tell us essentially, recommend this is how much you should be charging based on what we see the outstanding claims and what the future might hold. And we've just been doing better than the actuarial reports. A lot of it due just because we've been doing better with bringing people back to work on their modified work programs and the like. But essentially, we're able to capitalize on about $1 million, over $1 million in reduced charges, of which about 519 are related to the general fund. We also talked about the shift of solid waste franchise fees. We did it this year. That was one of the measures we did to balance this year's budget, and it'll continue to next year. That will shift about $440,000 from our solid waste fund into our general fund. And we will be coming back to the committee later, because one of the questions that was asked of the committee of staff was to look at how we might be repaying some of the monies that were put into that fund, in the solid waste fund, over the last several years, and repay back to the general fund and come up with at least a repayment strategy for that. The two items combined help bring that problem down to by almost $1 million. We also refined our budget estimates, and that's both on a revenue side, where we had some increases. In fact, that number is a net number of revenue increases and expenditure increases that, as we move forward since December, the numbers have changed a little bit. But on the revenue side, we have increased them by almost $500,000 because of just the most recent data that we've seen. In particular, our bed tax. We had made some assumptions about where we would be by the end of the year, but because things came in better in January and February and also in March, we tweaked those up a little bit, and that's reflected in that one number. Again, there are some expenditure increases that are in there that helped actually offset those revenue increases, but on a net basis, it did add to the problem of $185,000. We are also proposing to reduce funding to community organizations by $367,000, and you saw a list of those. It's the CVB, it's the Old Spanish Days and the like. So we discussed that just recently. And then, of course, the big items relate to the departments. The budget measures that are in the recommended budget include some revenue enhancements. In most cases, or a lot of cases, it's actually new revenue rather than just increased revenues. But most of it comes from spending cuts of $4.2 million. So in total, departments contributed $5.2 million to the problem, still remaining a gap of $2.6 million. And that gap, our expectation is it would be closed by even more than that through labor concessions that we're trying to achieve with all the bargaining groups. So that's sort of where we're at right now. And so the discussions for the next several months will be not only how we close the gap, but a lot of it will be when we look at departments, particularly with full council, how they came up with the $5.2 million and what the impacts are. So unless there are any questions on this, I'm going to turn it over to Jill Tara, who will talk about our non-departmental revenues.
Thank you, Bob. Bob's going to put up a summary, which is the first page of the packet that I've just passed out, showing some of the major non-departmental revenues. These are certainly the largest, but it's not an exhaustive list that everything we budget in non-departmental, but these are the ones that we really zero in on and take a lot of time in looking at our assumptions and forecasting them, both for the current fiscal year to figure out where we'll end the year, as well as where we think we're going next year. So I'd like to walk you through how to read this. The column on the left shows the major non-departmental revenues that we'll discuss today. Primarily they're tax revenues like sales tax, property tax, TOT, UUT, but there are also other types of fees and licenses like the franchise fee, the business license, property transfer tax, interest on the portfolio, where we think we'll end that next year, as well as VLF, which is our vehicle license fee. So the categories are on the left. The first column there shows the actual for fiscal year 2010 or 2009, which is where we ended the year. The middle columns in the blue show both the year-end estimate for the current fiscal year back in December, and those were the numbers that we developed when we did initial balancing for the general fund, and where we thought we would end this year, and use those to forecast 2011, and those were the numbers that were used when we determined that we had an $8.9 million problem next year. Since that time, since departments worked on developing their budgets, we got near the end of the budget development cycle and looked at updated information on how all these revenues were coming in and refined our forecast so that we came up with some better year-end numbers and some better numbers to build the fiscal year 2011 budget. The far right column in yellow does show the numbers that are reflected in the budget document that was filed with you last Tuesday. And as Bob mentioned, both the March forecast for the current fiscal year as well as next year included increases, which actually helped the problem. I'll go through sales tax, property tax, and TOT. I brought some additional schedules so we can go through those assumptions in a little bit more detail, but let me walk you through some of the more notable items on this page. We'll skip down to UUT. UUT at the end of fiscal year 2009 came in at just over $6.8 million. That was growth, modest growth of only 0.1%. Back in December, we were seeing big declines in several sectors, primarily gas and electricity, as you've heard about in both our fiscal year and our mid-year report to you. And it looked like we were going to end the year down 2%. We have seen a turnaround in several of the UUT sectors, and we now believe we'll end up with overall growth at the end of this year of 1.5%. And so we raised the year-end estimate by $241,000. For next year, we checked with all the utility providers as well as the UUT charged on the city's water and factored those into our forecasts. And the forecast is an overall growth of 1.3% with varying growth by sector. And these are consistent with the utility provider forecasts for our region. So we're pretty comfortable with that number now. Franchise fees, again, we checked with the utility providers. We now think we'll end the year down 1%, and that's primarily due to the way that the gas franchise fee is paid. The gas company advances us based on the previous year's revenue, and they over-advanced us for 10. So you'll see a big decline in the 2011 overall in franchise fees, down 3%, but that's primarily due to the fact that the first 4 months of next fiscal year we won't receive any gas franchise fees until the resets, and we start receiving that again. Business licenses, as you can see, we thought back in December we'd end the year down 1.2. That was annualizing our year-to-date renewals and new businesses that had licensed. We thought it would be about $2.27 million. As we got further through the fiscal year, we realized in looking at the receipts in those subsequent 3 months that the local economy was the troubles in the local economy were really reflected more so in our business license. So we expect the end of the year at $2.1 million. We lowered that current year estimate down by $105,000, and we kept it flat for next fiscal year. We're really not sure how quickly the local economy will turn around, and it is one of the smaller non-departmental revenues, so we're more comfortable with that. Property transfer tax. Really, this is a revenue that is all over the place, and it represents a small tax that is based on the price that's charged when properties change hands. It tends to be a leading indicator for the number of transfers, but again, it's not really reflected up above in our property tax growth numbers simply because we're seeing the properties that are turnover have a lower average and median home price. So it's not those type of increase in property turnovers are not reflecting into higher property tax rates. Annualized, we were able to bump that by about $32,000 for the current year-end estimate at $358,100 and kept it flat for next year. Portfolio interest, back in December, we left our adopted budget number flat, which was about $500,000, and we've done a pretty good job of managing this low interest rate and low yield environment using a slightly higher percentage in callables where we'll get a little bit higher. Based on that, as well as the amount of existing securities that were purchased a long time ago at higher rates, we were able to raise that by $320,000, and we think that's a good number for the end of this year. However, when analyzing what we expect to be able to buy in to the market as those higher yielding securities mature, we expect it should be down about 25% next year to 600,000. This used to be a very big revenue source in the general fund, and in this market, it's become a small slice of the pie. The last is VLF, and you can see in 2009, we received $320,000. We have seen over time the administration fees that the state charge us just skyrocket, and so some months the fees that the administration fees that they're charging cities and counties are more than the VLF that they collected. So that $150,000 appears to be holding as a good estimate based on the receipts year to date, and we're holding it flat for next year. We'll go into a little bit more detail on sales tax. Over on the left-hand side, I've shown the history of both the actual from 2001 to 2009, as well as the revised budget for 2010. And you can see, with the exception of 2002, which was the small recession due to the impact of 9/11, we've shown healthy growth in sales tax over time, and really by the end of 2008, you can see we ended the year down 2.5% and then down 11% in 2009. Of course, this is no surprise to you. We're expecting to be down the current fiscal year by 6.6%. If you look at the table on the right, it shows the actual by quarter for 2008 and 2009, and the quarterly projection that we're using to come up with the year end for the current fiscal year. So our September quarter came in at almost $4.3 million, which was a 16.9% decline. We did do a little better on the December quarter. We came in 3.3% down, but it wasn't such a significant improvement that we felt it was justified of changing the December forecast. We've left that flat for the remaining 2 quarters, and so expect to end the year at $16.44 million. And again, left the estimate for 2011 flat also. This is consistent with what other cities and counties are doing as far as my research is concerned, and I've also talked in detail and gone through the sales tax forecasts with Muni Services, who are our sales tax consultants, and they do quite a complicated analysis by sector based on the businesses in our city. They factor in new businesses coming in, businesses that have closed, and we are right in the range of their most likely to optimistic forecast for next year, so we feel comfortable at this point, without any additional information of exactly when the economy is going to turn around, leaving it flat for next year at $16.4 million. Are there any questions on sales tax?
Any questions from members of the committee?
No. Okay. We can move on to transient occupancy tax, and this is a very important revenue for the city. While it's not the biggest revenue, it's truly a leading indicator because we get the results so quickly. As you know, sales tax is reported a quarter in arrears, but we get this by the 10th of the following month, so we can really see how local businesses are doing. Again, over on the left, with the exception of 2002, you can see we just saw wonderful increases in our healthy economy years through 2007 and 2008 when the recession hit. It really, our TOT really suffered, ending the year in 2008 with 0.7% growth. 2009 ended the year down 6.9%, and based on reforecasts, we expect to end this year down 7.3%. Now, originally for our December forecast, we had forecast a decline of 6.5% over the remaining months of the fiscal year, and you can see that we did better, posting slight positive growth in January of 0.8%, and February. Combination of the film festival falling entirely in February, as well as building on terrible growth the February of the year before, down 20%. We revised those, and at some point when you're building on such huge declines, it's hard to decline more, so we feel that this is a good just to take it to raise the estimate so that it's only a decline of only 1% for the remaining months. And again, not knowing how quickly our local economy will improve, we left that flat for next fiscal year, consistent with our sales tax estimates. And the last major tax revenue that I'll go over today is the property tax. And you can see large growth in property tax. 2001, 7.1, and it goes on up from there down to 2008, where we started seeing less growth. And in 2009, even less growth at 3.6%. This is a number that, with the exception of the supplemental, and I'll explain that in a minute, we know pretty much what that number is going to be, because by November of each year we get the assessed roll from the county, so we're comfortable with the year-end forecast. The big wild card in there is the supplemental line, which is the third line down in the table on the right, and that's the tax charged on the difference between the assessed value and the market value when a property turns over, and it's charged to the buyer as a supplemental, and then that wraps into the property tax base the next year. And down at the bottom, you can see the tax history. We just saw huge increases in that, running from 20% increase from 2003. 2005 was a 91% increase. 2006, which was our highest year, supplemental came in at $1.3 million. But based on our year-to-date, how we're coming in, we think we'll end the year with $300,000 in supplemental, and we've kept that flat. Now, our overall property tax for fiscal year 2011, we've budgeted taking it down 1% to $22.79 million, and that's consistent with the 1% decline that the county also is forecasting for next year. I did talk to the county, and while the assessed roll hadn't been completed when we did our final forecast of this, they didn't see any major reassessments or anything that could potentially sway that more. That's not to say that something else didn't come in the last few days of March, but for now we're pretty comfortable with the down 1%. And that concludes my detail, but I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Does the committee have any questions on TOT property tax, or the two that was not gone over in detail, the UUT or franchise fees?
Yes.
Yes, I included those in your packets just for your reference.
Mr. Francisco.
Thank you, Ms. Tara. I may have missed this, and if I did, I apologize. Have we gotten the March actuals on TOT?
Yes, we have. Yes, we have. The March actual for TOT was up 8.3%. Okay. So year to date, our growth is down 8.5%, and we think we'll end the year at down 7.3%. So we still have to post growth for the remaining 3 months, but yes.
Okay, thank you.
It was good news.
Councilmember Self, any questions? No. I have a question on UUT. You've budgeted 0% growth for gas. Is that just because of the level of volatility? You really don't know whether it's going to go up or down, and you just sort of, throw a dart in the dartboard and it happens to go to zero. I mean, I understand
right.
Gas is one of those things that it's really hard to predict, so I could imagine, but I was just wondering if you have any deeper crystal ball than just knowing that it always is going up or down, and without us usually knowing in advance.
Yes, and Chair Williams, you've been listening to me when I say, gas and electricity are the hardest to predict because it's dependent on commodity pricing, and it can be all over the place. We left it flat, and I called the gas company, and they said based on the revenue that they expect for this franchise area, that's what they're expecting. So
Okay.
it's
Great.
a combination of us and confirming that with the gas company.
Great, thank you. Okay, that's it for revenue and balancing strategy. We're on to community development.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and committee members. I'm Paul Casey. Community development fees, I'll give you a quick overview of what we're going to be presenting to you. First off, building and safety fees. We are not recommending any changes to building and safety fees, so we won't be focusing on that this afternoon. I'll have Betty Weiss, City Planner, talk about some of the increases in planning fees that we're proposing, with a focus, of course, on the conceptual proposal for an appeal fee change based upon feedback we've had over the years to look at our appeal fee structure. We have an idea to present to you that we'd like feedback on. There's lots of different ways of looking at changing our appeal approach, and so we can talk about that as well. Answer your questions in that regard, and then give you a status report on the rental housing mediation funding issue that Council at last year's budget cycle asked us to look at a more consistent way of funding rental housing mediation, and we're going to give you a status report on that. We don't have a recommendation today about to go forward, but we do have a concept that we're working on that we wanted to get your feedback. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Weiss for the first part of the presentation.
Give Bob that handout.
Ms. Weiss.
Thank you, Chair Williams and members of the Finance Committee. On the overhead is an outline of the key points that I'll be discussing today. First of all, in terms of the planning fees, we've had general policy direction from the Council to structure our fees such that we're aware of how much general fund subsidy is involved in supporting the planning processes and how much or a percentage that is the cost that is recovered by the fees. We've presented fee discussions at joint meetings of the Planning Commission and City Council, and then annually or periodically whenever we give updates regarding the budget. So the policy direction to date has been, there was a big push in the approximately 2006, 2007 to increase the fee structure so that the amount of general fund subsidy was reduced. Our initial targets were between 20 and 30% that we were raising the fees so that the recovery was approximately 20 to 30%. However, as we have looked at the fees over time and have made adjustments and increases, we do see some of our fee programs and services closer to 50% recovery, and then other services have traditionally been closer to 100%. Those where we've collected a fee closer to the 100% level are the zoning information reports, plan checking, mailing services for mailing labels, and I think I mentioned plan check as well. The 50% category has traditionally been where the design review process has been falling. Many of the Planning Commission cases, the larger subdivision projects, our recovery is somewhere between 20 and 30% of those costs. And then there's a category where we've kept traditionally low, such as sign permits, where we've kept the sign permit structure low so as to encourage people to get those permits. So that's just by way of background. What we're looking at for this year is really, we tried to limit the overall changes in the fee structure throughout, but did look at some fees where we felt an increase of approximately 10% would help in the revenue projections and recovery, and our services where we're really not recovering towards that 50% area, and where we do spend quite a bit of important time in review. So the pre-application review team, an increase in that fee is proposed. The homes over 85% of the floor area ratio, that was a specific request we had from the Single Family Design Board to look at increasing that fee. It's an additional $200 fee for analysis that goes into the over 85%. Coastal development permits, actually, that involves a fair amount of review and coordination on coastal issues, both locally, sometimes with the state, and throughout the city, so we did look to raise those fees approximately 10%. Condominium conversions, that fee, again, there's a lot involved in the review process. I can't tell you specifically whether or not we're at a 30% recovery on condo conversions, but that's our goal, and I think this 10% increase will help achieve that. The one area that I want to talk a little bit more about, because I do see some representatives from the Santa Barbara Association of Realtors here, and I've been working with them to look at the Zoning Information Report program. With different cuts in our staff that have occurred last year, as well as recommended positions being eliminated in this budget, I've been really concerned about balancing all of the city's programs, including zoning enforcement, counter, sign committee, ZIRs. And this work is done primarily by our planning technician level. And so we are looking at potentially losing some planning technicians. So I wanted to look at what possible changes we can make to the ZIR program. And at the same time, the Board of Realtors group was very interested in talking with me about making changes. So what we've come up with for this year is making the condominium ZIR optional. What we've found with the Zoning Information Report, it's part of our housing element. It's recommended as a valuable program for all parties involved. It is part of the real estate transaction, so certainly buyers and sellers, it helps in the disclosure related to city permits and status of the property, but it also has been very important to keep the city's database and knowledge base about what's going on in the community on any individual property more up to date. We do actually see through the Zoning Information Report process illegal conditions that warrant creating an enforcement case. Our threshold for finding things in the ZIR that then become enforcement cases, there's a focus on illegal units and unpermitted habitable space. We don't follow up on everything we find on a property, say a storage shed in the side yard, or too much storage in your garage, or an unpermitted deck. But we do note those all for the record, so the ZIR is complete. So the ZIR process is really important, but the Board of Realtors were interested in having us look at possibly doing that a different way. And we came to the conclusion for this year that really that good information to help the city have a complete database and follow up on important violations is not there with the condominiums. You know, they're really pretty self-regulating with their homeowners association. There's only so much that you can do in an individual condominium. And so our idea is to make them optional. Now, that means that we will probably still do a number of ZIRs for condominiums. But I was looking to reduce the burden for the realtors. They were interested in that, the time and effort involved in getting the ZIR, and I was also interested in reducing our services where it's made sense. So the Zoning Information Report fee would remain the same for condominiums at $330, and there is an increase proposed in the fee price for the homes and other projects at $465 as recommended. We actually decreased our hourly rate in looking at the fee resolution, and some of our services we'd like to go more towards hourly rates for more recovery, full cost recovery. And I looked at the overhead structure and how we got up to $200 an hour, and that included more of my time and other city management time, and so we've taken that out actually of the hourly rate because most of the services that we're charging this for really don't involve that much management time. And also the fee had just been increased over time due to one year or the other increasing the fees across the board. And so I'm comfortable with the new hourly rate of $120, and that's reflective of a composite of our core planning staff, from planning tech to senior planner, including that supervisor position. So that's the recommendation on the hourly rate. There are many fees in the city's planning fee resolution that we've recommended remain unchanged for this year. Traditionally, we would do more of an across-the-board adjustment, but given concerns in the community about the economy and everyone being down, we decided not to be looking at this aggressively for increase. And one specific example is the people who have been coming in for the fire rebuilds. There would be no increase in their basic fees in the planning reviews. So there's no change there. We have put out for your consideration one option on a possible change to the appeal fee structure. The appeal process for the city, where decisions from the Planning Commission, ABR, HLC, or Single Family Board go to the City Council. Over the years, as we make budget presentations and have discussions, we've been asked, we should do something different. We should look at changing both the appeal process and the appeal fee. And we realize that there are a multitude of ways that you can do this. We've looked at what some other communities do, and we put out this one option for your consideration. The city's current appeal fee is $395. That represents the type of appeal fee that other communities have, where the policy behind that is to keep the fee low, and that would generally be considered encouraging and supporting due process and neighbors and nonprofit groups or whatever being able to have access through the appeal process. And there are other communities in our Tri-County area that have low appeal fees. For example, the city of San Luis Obispo has an appeal fee of $100. The city of Ventura has a $900 appeal fee. And the county of Santa Barbara has a $650 appeal fee. So we're on the lower end of a fairly low set appeal fee. Again, some of these agencies actually charge full cost recovery during the other parts of the review process, but they intentionally keep the appeal fee low. The city of Goleta actually has a major appeal fee of $2,000. And other communities in the state of California also recover more in the appeal process, be that paid by an applicant or by an appellant during the appeal process. So one option that we're putting out there to consider is a deposit, that you have a substantial appeal fee deposit when someone files an appeal. And then we do some mediation and appeal resolution already when parties are interested and staff believes there is a possible solution to the appeal such that it wouldn't go to hearing and we could reach a reasonable solution. I think there's a lot of interest in the process and how the appeal process might be enhanced. One of the things that we hope to do, be it formally in this process or just ongoing, again, is when we meet with the parties involved, could we perhaps refine the issues and make it clear what is the matter that should really be before the city council? What ends up happening, and that could be a difficult resolution process, but people really want to put kind of the kitchen sink in their appeal, and that does take a lot of time and money, and we'd like to see if a mediation process could, if not result in the appeal being withdrawn, at least result in refining what the appeal issues are. The other idea in this option is to look at, depending on the outcome of the appeal, that there could be a refund of a portion of that appeal fee. When we discussed this with the Planning Commission last week, so far I've spoken with the Planning Commission, the Single Family Board, and the Sign Committee. I have additional committees to go to, but there is an interest in seeing some sort of sliding scale. There is definitely a concern on people's parts that a substantial fee such as $3,000 would really preclude people from participating with that financial burden, say a neighbor to someone's home. And there's a concern that, the applicants involved, they're seeking an improvement and a monetary gain perhaps. I don't think that's always the case. Again, it could be one neighbor and another, and building a fence is not necessarily a major monetary gain, but those do result in appeals. So, but there's an interest in maybe having the percent of refund to be different depending on the nature of the appeal and the nature of the outcome of the appeal. One consideration that we have is, if we do a process like this, that there should be a new base fee created, and that perhaps at the $1,000 mark, that would be an appropriate end appeal rate if we were to adjust these rates up. We have not anticipated any revenue from appeals. This is not a revenue generating proposal. It's a cost reduction in savings, if you want to think of it in budgetary terms. And we're bringing it to you for your consideration. And we're open to moving forward as part of this budget process or however the council sees fit in terms of addressing appeals. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any public comment on this item? Come on up. We'll start with our planning commissioner.
Great, thank you. I just wanted to report to follow up on last week's Planning Commission meeting. We are in support, I should say, myself, I am in support of the fee structure that staff has proposed. We've been discussing this for nearly 6 years at the Planning Commission. We've seen a gradual movement towards greater cost recovery. We continue to believe that this is a good way to go. When it comes to the appeal process, it's a little bit more complicated. Not that it should be, but that's the way life works. What we've seen is, at least last week, I recommended that the city consider using the same approach that the Coastal Commission uses. They make a finding of substantial issue before they take a particular issue and invest a considerable amount of time in it. So that's one way to take a look at whether the appeal is a significant one or not. On the issue of mandatory mediation, I proposed such a process 20 years ago to the city, and I'm glad to see that it's coming about. It is a cost-effective way to get things done if it's supported strongly by the city council, because most people want to come to you as the final decision makers and have you arbitrate their issues. It's more difficult depending on the type of appeal it is. If you're talking about a rezone or general plan amendment, that's a policy discussion, and that's not very often applicable in terms of using a mediation process, because that really does belong in your hands as opposed to having an appellant and an applicant trying to resolve that issue. On other issues such as development plan approval or a subdivision where there are technicalities to be worked out, the use of a mediation process can be very effective in taking workload off of staff, taking decisions off your desk, and pushing them down to the most appropriate level at which they should be made. Moreover, when you have two or more parties come to a mediated solution, it's their solution, and they're more likely to live with it over time and implement it as opposed to going through the court system and going back and trying to get a different outcome. So that's really important. Lastly, while it's not rocket science, it's not sandwich making either, and there are people who are experienced in professional mediation, and I would really urge you to let the appellants and applicants utilize the process in the open market where they can collectively amongst themselves choose a mediator, make the investment in that mediator, and then let that mediator help them to come to a decision on their own. Having staff do it, I don't think is a good idea, because as professional as staff is, there is very often a perceived interest in the outcome. And from my experience over my career, it is better to have a full-on neutral to help you through the process, one with experience and technical understanding, but one who is arm's length away from the process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Justice. Mr. Caldwell?
Thank you, Chair Williams. Jim Caldwell for the Santa Barbara Board of Realtors. I brought a letter today from our president, Elaine Abercrombie, explaining our position on the proposed changes to the ZIR regulations. And first, may I compliment staff, particularly Betty, in the willingness to work with us and, shall we say, revising the way that the zoning reports are currently handled. Briefly, we totally support making condominiums an optional part of the ZIR reports. As noted, most of the condo associations are far more complete in their inspection of condominiums than anything that we as realtors and or city could do. So that process eliminates a lot of extra work on everybody's part. The continued search for other alternatives, I think, is very important. The one thing is, as we've mentioned to several of you when we've met, any increase in fees currently to the zoning reports is something that we can't currently condone, particularly in light of the present market conditions and looking back in the service level previously. I think at best we should hold them where they are, because our zoning inspection costs here in Santa Barbara far exceed many other cities of comparable nature, and I really feel is something that we should leave alone at the present time.
Thank you, Mr. Caldwell.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. All right, so let's go.
Mr. Americana.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I'm Steve Americana from the Brownstein Law Firm. I'm actually speaking here on my own behalf today, not representing anybody. A number of us in the private sector who deal with land use issues have been talking about, number one, the economy, number two, the serious fiscal problems that the city is facing, the county is facing, and we've been talking about ways of addressing that issue or those issues. The discussions that we had led to an interesting remark the other day that somebody made, talking about the land use decision-making process that we've established in Santa Barbara County, and somebody observed that process is now our most important product. And our suggestion is that we take a hard look at process, take a hard look at the amount of resources devoted by both the city and the private sector to dealing with process, and see if we can find a better way. Trimming process where we can, and in particular focusing on issues that are of importance to the community and that are controversial. Let me talk specifically about appeals, because appeals are a very good example of the problem that we're talking about. We think that there are ways of conducting the appeals and reforms in the appeal process that could, in fact, significantly reduce the city's costs. And our suggestion is that the city implement the kind of appeal screening mechanism that's used by other public agencies, specifically the Coastal Commission. The Coastal Commission, if you want to file an appeal from the granting of a coastal development permit by the city, requires you to file your appeal. You have to state with specificity the grounds for your appeal. You have to state the facts on which you are basing your appeal, and you have to demonstrate that you raised all of those issues before the city agency whose decision you're appealing. At that point, the Coastal Commission staff looks at the appeal document and determines whether or not the staff thinks there is a substantial issue under the Coastal Act. They make a threshold determination, does this appeal raise a substantial issue? And the staff then presents that recommendation to the Coastal Commission on the consent calendar and either concludes, yes, there's a substantial issue, or no, there's no substantial issue. The Coastal Commission considers that without a hearing and determines yes or no. If the answer is yes, then an appeal hearing is scheduled. If the answer is no, there's no substantial issue, no appeal hearing is scheduled, and the matter is finished at that point. We think if you look back at the appeals that have come to the Planning Commission and the City Council over the last few years, at least some portion of those appeals did not in fact raise any substantial issue under the city's ordinances, general plans, policies. That they raised other kinds of issues. Betty used the word kitchen sink. And we think there's a lot of kitchen sink issues raised in those appeals. We think that the number of appeals would be reduced if people were required to focus on the city's rules that applicants have to follow to get a permit, the policies that apply, the ordinances that apply. So we think that applicants, if they're required to do that, if they're not simply permitted to raise old grudges, neighborhood disputes, personal problems, other kinds of issues that, frankly, in a small community like this do occasionally arise between neighbors, that we will in fact find that the city's appeal process is not being used for some personal agenda, but instead it should be limited to be used for implementation of the city's policies. The other beneficial aspect of this is that we would our suggestion would require that appellants raise their issues as early as possible in the process, so that the idea of a late hit, of an ambush, you wait until the end of the process and then throw in an appeal and take it to the city council, raise issues that never came to the planning commission, never came to the zoning administrator, that would be prohibited. That we wouldn't allow people to do that anymore, because frankly that's an abuse of the process, and every appeal that is heard before the city council that shouldn't be there, in fact, costs the city money. And the estimate I saw in the article on this hearing today was that an appeal typically costs $10,000, costs the city $10,000 in staff time, and the city recovers some very small fraction of that. If you can reduce the number of appeals by 1/3, you will have accomplished the same as taking the appeal fee to $3,000, if you can reduce the number of appeals by 1/3. The other thought that I wanted to propose to you is that the city start to take a hard look at non-controversial projects. There are plenty of people who apply for permits which no one has any concerns with. And yet, because we have a single process for taking applications through, those permits are scheduled for hearings before a zoning administrator or before the planning commission, simply because that's what the rules require, even though there's no question that the permit complies with city policies and ordinances, and there's no concern raised in the neighborhood. And our suggestion would be that with non-controversial projects in which there's no one who is requesting a hearing, that there be no hearing, that public notices be sent, that people be told, if you think that there's an issue here, send us back a letter, tell us what the issue is and that you want a hearing. And again, staff would determine, yes, there's a real legitimate issue here, we should schedule a hearing. But if there's nobody who sends back a request for a hearing, why go through that exercise? Why put the staff to the expense and time of preparing a staff report for a hearing that nobody wants and nobody believes is necessary, simply because we have a system in place that requires it? This falls into the category of what I call don't sweat the small stuff. If there's stuff that's small, that's non-controversial, let's stop focusing city energies on it. That way, city staff resources are available for the big stuff, for the important issues that do come to the city council or to the planning commission that really require the kind of devoted staff attention that is needed. So in an era of limited resources, this is one of those ways in which we can live within our resources, not just our environmental resources, but now our fiscal resources as well. And our suggestion is that we take a hard look at those kinds of procedural changes to see if we can reduce the pressure on staff to do the same amount of work with what is obviously a much lower level of resources. Those are the two suggestions I'd like to offer for your consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Maricona. Mr. Green or Ms. Reyes? Well, go ahead. Mr. Green is a gentleman, so.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Will you entertain comments now about the budget generally and about Ms. Tara's report on revenues and expenditures, or you?
Technically, because it's all one item, you can address any of the.
Okay, I'll make my comments very brief. You know, some of the things. First off, my name's George Green. I am a staff person for SEIU Local 620. We represent the general unit, which is your largest group of city employees. We're currently in discussions with you folks about concessions. We made an affirmative proposal last week that you're going to hear about later today from your folks, your bargaining team. But I had, you know, Jill's been very helpful to the process that we're going through and has gone out of her way to come, you know, and give us information while we're talking to the city about concessions. And a couple things that jumped out to me that I really wanted to say to Finance Committee, and I'll say to Council on another day because I have to be at a meeting up north after this. But you know, you've still got $1 million in this capital reserve, which frankly I was shocked. I thought that would have been spent down during the year. You've got this $1.3 million loan to the waterfront, which last year, you know, we were saying you should call it in. I think the action you took last year was to make it an interest, to charge interest to the waterfront department. But, you know, politically, when we're making concession offers to you folks, we've got a whole group of folks who are working at the waterfront. You're not getting any of that money into the general fund. It's going into an enterprise fund that doesn't really need the capital that's coming from the furlough or whatever concessions we give to you. So that $1.3 million loan that you tacked interest on last year, you know, we would suggest that you call the waterfront, you know, commensurate with the salary savings that they're getting from any agreement that we negotiate, you call that part of the loan back to the general fund for this fiscal year. Couple other things. I guess you already found the 440 in the solid waste fund, but the other thing is Measure G, the UUT money. There's nothing. I mean, there is a certain maintenance of effort. You know, I worked on Measure G. I walked a lot of precincts. I'm pretty familiar with you know what we got passed. There's nothing keeping you in this budget year. I mean, we would strongly encourage you to do it. And I know there was discussion about it last year. It looks like it did not happen. Excuse me. There's nothing saying that you have to break that up half into the streets fund and half into the general fund. You could put 3/4 of that Measure G money into the general fund and 1/3 of it into the streets fund. You could not do that on an ongoing basis. I don't think that would maintain the maintenance of effort. I think you'd start losing Measure G money if you did that as an ongoing policy matter. But for a one-time, you know, the thing that strikes me the most about Jill's thing today, and again, I a tremendous amount of respect for Jill and Bob Samario and all your finance people, but when you're talking, the folks I represent that we're making concession proposals about, their average salary is right around $47K. And, you know, when you talk about the property tax, sales tax, and TOT and what it's going to do this year, you're asking us to make concessions based on guesses. And, you know, there are one-time monies still out there that balanced with, again, we made a significant proposal last week, and I don't want to sandbag your folks by representing what our proposal is before you hear it in closed session. But we've made a significant proposal, but we need for the folks that are elected to come up with one-time monies to bridge us until next year, and those are some of our suggestions. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Ms. Reyes?
Hi. I'm a vice president of the Allied Neighborhood Associations, and you all received, I think, a memo stating that by a phone conference, all of the officers, board members expressed serious concerns about what they consider an extremely excessive increase in the appeals item. I think that any of the suggestions that have been made by Mr. Americaner, Mr. Justice, would be necessary to be discussed by Allied. And I think they would want to have a very definite voice in the matter. One of the problems that I see, and this is my opinion, is the city has been rather lax in following their own rules. And when you buy something or you plan something and your neighbor comes in and does something that's contrary and affects your value, you go and you want to see the rules for everybody the same, and this has not happened time and time again. In today's market, I can tell you it's extremely difficult. It would be almost impossible for neighborhood associations to collect $3,000. It's hard to get even $10 from a resident for membership dues, and $3,000 is not feasible. You are effectively shutting down the ability of the neighborhoods and the residents to appeal projects. And that is going to foster a lot of resentment and distrust in the community. If the residents appeal, they raise the money, that's lost. but the developer or somebody who's going to make profit out of this, that can be taken off as a tax write-off, business expense. So this is something that has very serious impacts on the neighborhood. And as our city gets further and further developed, we see more and more people pushing the envelope and pushing the envelope. And the ability to come to the council and say, look, folks, we need a decision. This is a problem, is going to be withdrawn from us by this fee. And I think there needs to be some understanding of what the economics of the guy who's out there living in a house, earning a daily salary, if they're going to be able to come up with this kind of money. So I ask you very seriously that you, one, do not support a $3,000 fee increase, and that you work with Allied and other groups to find a more reasonable manner of dealing with this problem. Thank you.
Can I ask a question of you, Ms. Reyes? So you're not saying that Allied is against any fee increase? Just
That was not a
excessive?
question. That was not a question that I asked the board members. I can only answer for myself. I can see it. I personally, myself, can see that a reasonable fee increase is sensible, but to $3,000. I mean, that's that's a lot of pecunia, as we say in Latin.
And how about the idea of this mandatory mediation?
I think that is something that Allied would like to discuss, and I also liked Mr. Americaner's idea that the Coastal Commission uses. The thing that you have to recognize is that there is a degree of distrust in the community of the planning staff, and that if you go into mandatory mediation, or the staff member makes a decision that there's no valid grounds for an appeal, somehow you have to find somebody who is above reproach to do this, and that's going to be difficult. But these things could be worked out and discussed. This is my opinion. But I know, in listening to people in the community who talk to me about things, that this will cause disgust in the community, and it will, with the buck stopping at the council, will affect the council. In my area of Hidden Valley, we have serious problems, and we have seen houses foreclosed. We have vacant houses. Money is tight for people. And an appeal, they consider, is their democratic right in a democratic government. So it has to all be balanced out, and I leave you all to stand on the ball and balance it.
Thank you, Ms. Reyes.
And just as a matter of interest to you all, I drove from work this morning, and the county is raising the speed limit on Modoc Road to 50 miles per hour.
Wow. Thank you, Ms. Reyes. That's not good news.
No.
Any other public comment? Hearing that, I just wanted to give staff any further chance for clarifications or anything that you need to present. And then it's Mr. Casey.
Mr. Chair, we're really interested in your feedback. Again, you know, we're trying to be responsive to questions over the years about increasing the recovery rate on appeal fees. We completely agree with a lot of the comments we heard today. There's a lot of different ways of looking at this. So we're interested in getting your direction, guidance, and reaction.
First of all, let's take questions before comments. Is there any questions from the committee members? Mr. Francisco.
Thank you. I just had the other sort of standout increase in here was the annexation fees, and I was just wondering what the rationale is for that.
I believe the amount increased would be 10%.
Maybe
it
I
should
misread
be. It's just that the base fee is a
Oh,
fairly.
I see.
It's a
It's how they're
fairly large
printed.
number.
Okay,
The
all right.
annexation process is one of our higher fees.
Yeah.
And that includes all of the city reviews, including Planning Commission, City Council, and submittal to LAFCO. It's one set fee.
Okay, fine.
But the number is large, yes.
Fine, thank you.
Committee member Self. Do you have questions?
Yes, I noticed that the renoticing fee goes up 100% from 200 to 400. Why?
Again, that is a comment that we typically hear from the boards and commissions. We've set up an agenda for a meeting. We've noticed the meeting. We've reserved time on the agenda, and then something changes with the application. The applicant asks to be postponed and so forth, and we have to renotice. Also, the city actually, the noticing the amount of people involved in any particular project, we pay the full first-class mail. That fee may sound, it is a substantial increase, but the reason is it causes ripple effects in the process, affects other applicants, and it still no way covers really the costs that the city's undertaking.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I do have one question. Is there any hope with this ZIR question? Will the process go any faster if we increase this fee, or is it going to continue at this same pace?
It does help to have the ongoing revenue related to the zoning information report. And with the elimination or the possible elimination of the condominiums, that could be a reduction in revenue. I try to dedicate a full staff person to the zoning information report. That's their primary duty, so they don't have divided priorities. And we do call on other city staff to help when we've had peaks. I am aware of some of the concerns that have happened in terms of scheduling, and we worked with the board during the furlough. They had a big concern about that, but we managed to get the ZIRs done. I think some of it is honestly a little bit of a staff management concern, and it's certainly been brought to my attention, and I'm doing what I can to address that. The fee revenue does help me feel confident that I can keep a planning technician. We're recommending in the budget reducing one planning technician. So it's a balance. We wanted to have a healthy revenue remain with the zoning information program, as we do try to dedicate one full-time person at a minimum to that. So we felt it was appropriate to increase the fee.
Okay.
But we are interested in on the last paragraph. I did want to mention, I'm interested in continuing to work with the Board of Realtors and look at how other communities perform this service. I'm willing to try test cases of outside contractors, any number of things that they have an interest in perhaps doing this a different way. And I just said for this year I couldn't go there, but we're going to keep the dialogue open and look at other approaches.
Okay. Councilmember Self.
Thank you, Chair Williams. I didn't notice any fee for modifications. I saw a fee for staff hearing officer. Is there a modification fee?
Yes, there is. It's on page, it's on my page 13, but I'm not sure in your full resolution if you have the same pages. At one point, they follow an alphabetical order.
The pages are the same.
Yes, it
and
is.
So
here.
it has title modifications. And we have the non-DART. Those are the ones that go to the staff hearing officer process, and they're currently $8.95, and we're proposing that remain the same. You see
Thank
that?
you. Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Okay, comments from the committee. And who wants to start? Seeing that, okay. Thank you, Mr. Francisco.
Well, first, I'd like to talk a little bit about Mr. Americaner's suggestions, and I think there is some possibility out there for a sort of an intermediate level in the appeal process. If we could do something similar to what we've done with rental housing mediation, if we could find a way, especially I think it would be appealing if we could find knowledgeable volunteers in the community who are willing to do something like that. That, to me, would be an ideal solution. Because oftentimes in the appeal process, we have neighbors coming in with what they they have a legitimate grievance, but they have absolutely zero understanding of the planning and community development process. And so if we had knowledgeable volunteers who could work with people like that, that might be a real opportunity for improvement. I also think that the idea of making the grounds of the appeal clear ahead of time and having council make a determination of whether it's something that's worth a hearing, I think is also a good suggestion. I think that would be good for both sides. Finally, on the topic of the increase in the appeal fees, I agree that a lot of staff time goes into considering an appeal, but I also believe that to a certain extent we have to blame ourselves for that. We have to come up with a way to make the whole development process clear enough, transparent enough, the rules regular enough that we don't get so many appeals. And I do believe that in order to keep this an open democratic process, this is a cost essentially that the city has to eat. So I would be against an increase of this magnitude. We might have an increase in line with other fee increases that we're doing in general, but this is too much for me.
I have similar feelings about the subjects covered. First I want to start with the ZIRs because I asked the question on it. I think that in order to defend this increase, we really would need to substantiate how what an increase of time would take place. I think we need to substantiate the better service that would take place and be able to give some reasonable estimate on that. So I'm not saying that I'm absolutely against it. I'm just saying that I think we need to legitimize that fee increase a little bit more. I believe that generally our fees are appropriate that are being proposed. I do think that usually the better thing for both appellants and applicants is to have a department that actually works at a reasonable amount of speed, even if that means higher fees, because time is more expensive often than the fees are, and because I don't think people in general in this city like the idea that we subsidize development. I think that they would like full cost recovery for development processes, and it's my goal to eventually get there. I suppose the economy has done a little bit about making that fully realizable. I do think that a $3,000 deposit or fee is too high. I do think that we should have a reasonable increase, because I do think if we're at the sort of near the bottom of even the agencies around here that have chosen to try to make very accessible fees, then I think that's too low. So to me, a fee somewhere between some of the other low agencies, maybe as high as $900 or as low as $650, would be appropriate. But I don't think we should hold the fee where it is. I do believe in mandatory mediation. I like Mr. Francisco's idea, but I think that would take time to set up. I think one way or another, we should require mandatory mediation by third parties. And if folks want to organize a volunteer pool instead of going to paid professional mediators, then that's fine too. But I think we should move the process in that direction. And I think only by requiring it would we move that in that direction. And let's see, anything else on that list that I have anything to say about? I do support the making ZIRs for condos optional. I would also say that ZIRs are very important for single-family homes and for most changes of property, and I'll just give you an example. The county does not have the ZIR requirement, and I just visited a woman, the Bragg family, if you see those Braggs, aminos and oils and so forth. She has bought a agricultural parcel out there, no ZIR, and she walked around, and everything looked like great space for her to both have an agricultural operation, but also have a call center and have her staff out there. And then, lo and behold, after she's already bought the parcel, she realizes almost all the buildings there are unpermitted. And so that is a mess that happens without ZIRs. But condos are a little bit different because there's the protection of the condo association. And so I do think that that's an appropriate change to take place. Any comments on this, Councilmember Sell?
Yes, I had mentioned to Mr. Lamone a short time ago that I could see setting up an ombudsman program, which would, mediation is another word for it, to work in behalf of someone who feels they have a problem, and that maybe the city would appoint this person and that they were paid a fee and would mediate between the two to end some of these programs. And I suggested maybe we could start it in one of the smaller commissions and committees and iron out the tweaks and then move it on. I think that would be very helpful. I agree with Judy Arias that the making a determination before an item could be heard, I would find very troublesome, because we are at a time when the community is on edge about a lot of the planning that has taken place. And I have suggested several times, and I am still of this opinion, that staff should not present their opinion when they make their presentation. Give me the facts, all the facts. I think when you are presenting an opinion, you are likely to be biased. And I think many people coming out of appeals feel very frustrated that we have staff on the side of the developer. Staff gives its 20 minutes, the developer gives the 20 minutes, and then you have your 20 minutes to rebut all of that. And so I think I am not at all of a mind to have one of our city bodies decide if they should hear an appeal or not. I think it's a good thing in the process that if you don't like what's going on, you can bring it before a body. And if you leave with that frustrated, well, that's just how it goes. The $10,000 for a cost of appeal, I question that because I have questioned many departments over the years before I was on council about, did they track staff time? They don't. So how do we know it's $10,000? We can pull any figure out of the air, and I really question that. I know that for anybody appealing, they often pay lawyers and architects and put in tremendous amount of time on their own, and that's not even tax deductible. But I think it would end a fundamental right and the transparency that we need in this system. And Mr. Amerikaner spoke about non-controversial. Nobody appealed the first monsters on Chapala Street because they were trusting that our commissions were doing their job to protect the community from that kind of development. So by the time we saw them rising out in concrete, this is when the community got engaged. We were trusting that the committees and commissions were upholding their responsibility. That is in the HLC purview, and you can't tell me that those are conforming to the existing neighborhood. And so it's these biases that we've seen that I think, anyway, I do not want to see a $3,000 fee or a smaller fee with staff time. There's no regulation on that. And I'm not against a little increase, but at a time when Social Security is flat for 2 years because of no inflation, when we are asking our bargaining units to give money back and we're furloughing people, we have retirees who have lost half of their 401ks, corporate pensions that have been slashed dramatically. I really kind of question all the increases. But, okay, you can move me a little bit, but that is not a little bit. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, can I just clarify one thing? Because we didn't make it as part of our presentation, so we apologize for that. We did an analysis of 3 appeals and tracked the actual time that it took to come up with that $9,000 to $10,000 range. That included all the planning staff time, but it also included city attorney staff time, city administrator time, clerk's office. But we did actually track 3 appeals to give us a ballpark idea of what a cost amount for an appeal is.
Okay, so I think we do need to give some, we've sort of generally talked, but I think we need to be a little bit more specific about what we're passing on to staff. I think what I'm hearing is that we are all in agreement that we recommend a mandatory mediation by a third party, a non-staff party. We are not in agreement as to what shape that is yet, but we are in agreement that that should be part of the appeal process. We are in agreement that $3,000 is too much, and that our current level could use a small increase. I guess I'm thinking that if the county is $650 and Ventura is $900, maybe, and those are all small jurisdictions, I'm questioning should we have it in somewhere in that range, or at least make it consistent with what the county has at this time. Is there any opinions on that, Mr. Francisco?
I think that, again, the appeal fee is unique, and it really is something about how our whole government works and the community's ability to influence the course of government. So I really think we need to be careful about it, and I would rather see any increase in that fee more in line with some of the other standard fee increases we're doing in other areas, like a 10% or something like that. That's what I would like to see.
Okay. All right. Then we are recommending let's say, a smaller increase of the appeal fee. I don't know. I would ask the committee members to think about getting parity with the county within 2 or 3 years, which would require a little bit more than 10% increase. I mean, I think that the county, obviously, and I do a lot of work in the city of Ventura. Believe me, everybody, people still are able to get together the money to make appeals in the city of Ventura and in the county. Can we talk about the recommendations put forward by Mr. Americano and Mr. Justice in regards to the idea that an appellant should at least have to base an appeal on an issue that was brought up at the hearing. This is a practice sometimes of bringing up different issues after the issues that they brought up in the hearing were not deemed sufficient, and it seems to me that it would be a fair element of the process to require that an appellant base their appeal on issues brought up in the discretionary review. especially because hearings are supposed to be quasi-judicial. We're supposed to be arbitrating something that is not necessarily new legislative matters. Does the committee have any opinion on that? Mr. Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, oftentimes the people who have an issue at appeal don't necessarily understand all the ground rules. They know something is wrong, but they don't know what it is. And so they may not have, during the actual initial hearing before the Planning Commission, known exactly how to formulate, based on the zoning ordinance, let's say, exactly what they thought was wrong, or based on how our process is supposed to go, what they felt was unfair. I do think it's reasonable to say, by the time someone is actually at the level of asking the council to consider an appeal, that all the grounds of that appeal be clearly laid out. We don't want the situation, as we have had sometimes, where we really don't know until the day of the appeal exactly what all the grounds of the appeal are. I don't think that's fair. And I think it's a reasonable request to make sure that the appellant has given the council ample notice of exactly what grounds and on what basis they are appealing a project. I think that would be a fair compromise. It's something we certainly don't have now. But I think it's too much of a burden to ask, in some cases, that the appellants, who often, let's face it, they're just homeowners who all of a sudden found themselves in what they consider a nightmare situation, understand enough about the process, have the same kind of understanding that Mr. Americano does, for instance, in order to list all of those things immediately.
And Councilmember Self?
I agree with Mr.
Okay.
Francisco.
And then the final issue is essentially this idea of substantial conformance. This is in a common practice of the Coastal Commission. Believe me, the Coastal Commission is not viewed as a pro-growth machine, and it's something that we've heard both from Ms. Reyes and from Mr. Justice and Mr. Americano, representing very different views on development in general. Look at that process as a good process. I don't think we need to recommend the process today, but is there interest on the committee's part in incorporating the substantial conformance, which essentially means that the council, before there is a hearing, has to say whether there is not substantial conformance, I'm sorry, I'm using the wrong terms of art, substantial issue. Has to determine whether there is a substantial issue in the appeal. This essentially, to me, would be a process by which appeals that are frivolous prima facie would be dispensed with. And obviously the council is the final arbiter, and being able to look at those on consent, I think, provides another level of accountability. We're not just giving this to staff to decide, but we have to look at it on consent. And if we believe that there is an issue, then we can vote to have a hearing. Council members.
Who would make that determination?
There would be a staff recommendation, but the council would make that determination.
But they always have a staff recommendation.
Right, and we would have to look at it on consent and decide whether we believe that to be the case or not.
Well, it's hard to make that case until you've seen the evidence. I mean...
Mr. Francisco?
Mr. Chairman, I think I was almost assuming that in my earlier statement about making sure that before we go forward we have a clear statement from the appellant of exactly what the grounds of the appeal are. And Mrs. Self, to your concerns, the idea, at least as I understand it, would not be us determining the merits of the appeal. It would be determining whether there are grounds for an appeal. Is, for instance, the appellant asserting that a modification was given inappropriately? And all you would really have to know to determine that was there a modification? Really. All we're asking is, are there at least potentially real grounds for an appeal, real grounds that, for instance, the zoning ordinance was violated, real grounds that due process was violated. And that's why I think that if we make it a ground rule of this process, that at some point before an appeal is actually heard, that the appellant explicitly lists all the grounds of the appeal, then I think it's reasonable for the council to say on consent, yes, these are reasonable grounds. And that doesn't say anything about whether the appeal itself is ultimately valid.
I am opposed to closing out community and citizen involvement, and I think it is very few and far between when you have someone who spends the money, gets the time, hires the attorney, goes through all of this without thinking they do have merit. And I think the fact that they think they have merit is enough for me to say, I will hear your case.
Mr. Chair.
Mr. Casey.
Just give you kind of staff's reaction. So we've thought about this in the past as well, and in many ways we come down on the same side as Councilwoman Self in that regard. It adds an additional process to prepare a consent item. It sounds like it's pretty simple, but it's another churn in the cog of the process. And looking back on the appeals you've considered over the last 2, 4, 6, 8 years, can you think of many appeals that you might have dismissed on a consent item and said there was no merit to hearing the appeal? And I think generally council has been more of the opinion of myself that, you know, there's passion, there's concern here. We owe these people an opportunity to kind of be heard. So I want to raise that by adding an additional layer of work. Are you really going to exercise it enough that's going to simplify the process? Or is it almost always going to be, yes, let's have the appeal hearing, then we've just added an additional step in the way?
I can only think of two, but I don't know if you can think of one or two. I don't know. The question is whether it's good. That's a good enough thing to do for one or two.
I can only think of one, and I'm absolutely positive the appellants would not have agreed.
Right.
And that the process of the appeal, I think, helped them get
Understand
to
that.
realization. Yeah. So it's a point well taken. I still believe that having some kind of a deadline for the appellant making the grounds for the appeal explicit before it gets to city council, so we as a council have an opportunity,
Mr. Casey,
to consider that.
Yeah, just in recognition of time, and also that this is a finance committee on the budget. What we're hearing is, you gave us some clear direction, and I think what we're taking away is some further direction to pursue on the appeal process that we're not going to wrap up as part of the budget process. It's going to be a separate policy discussion, getting the city attorney's office involved and other boards and commission feedback. And so I think we've heard good kind of guidance about where to go in that regard and the direction on the fee schedule itself, which we do want to resolve as part of the budget process. That unless there are any further comments, I think we've gotten good direction today.
Okay.
Okay, so we need to do a motion, and I guess my question is, would the committee accept getting up to the level of the county, which is $650 in 2 years, meaning half this year and half the following year?
No.
Councilmember Self, and so what is your opinion on how much it should be?
I think the 10% is adequate.
Mr. Francisco?
I agree.
Okay. Then we will, then can someone put a motion for the fee resolution, advancing that to council, but making the amendment on the appeal?
I move that we change the amount of the increase for appeals to no more than 10% of the current fee.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Opposed? Now can I get a motion on the fee resolution and the community development fees in general?
I move to accept the other fee recommendations.
I'll second if we make the amendment of holding out the ZIR fee increase for now until we can get clarity on that.
I can accept that.
Okay. There's a motion and a second. All
Yes,
those
there
in
is.
favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? None. Okay. Are we ready for Public Works? Make it fast.
Mr. Chair, we got one more
Oh,
item
you got one
for
more.
us on rental housing mediation,
Okay.
which
Yes.
Mr. Bossi will shrink his presentation down substantially because this is really just a check-in. We're not looking for action. There's not a recommendation as part of the budget, but it lets you know where we're at and what we're thinking about.
Mr. Bossi.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and Finance Committee members. As I sat in the audience, I continually whittled down my approach here, so I'm just going to be as quick as I possibly can. This is in regards to the Rental Housing Mediation Task Force, and as Mr. Casey indicated, this is just an update on where we're at. The Rental Housing Mediation Task Force has been around since 1976. The program helps to resolve tenant and landlord residential rental housing disputes out of court by providing information and or staff consultation on tenant and landlord rights and responsibilities, as well as through mediation services. I should let you know that these services are all free. The program is very heavily used. And what happens, our mediations are conducted, they can be conducted by telephone or in person, depending how detailed they are. But they're conducted by city staff, as well as at least two of 15 trained volunteer mediators who are appointed by the City Council to the Rental Housing Mediation Task Force. Now, historically, as far as staff is concerned, we've had 2 full-time folks, as well as 1 to 2 part-time people filling the Rental Housing Mediation Task Force. In 2007 and 2008, that was shrunk down to just 2 full-time staff. In 2009, it was proposed due to budget constraints to further whittle that down to 1 full-time person. We started out and quickly realized that was not enough staffing to keep this program going. Staff was reduced, but the need for the program was not. And we added 2 part-time people in fiscal year 2009, and that continues in today's budget. We have 1 full-time and 2 part-time folks running this program. Now, in previous budget years, Council has directed us to look at filling our financial gap there, looking at ways to get this program to basically a 2 full-time, 1 to 2 part-time people, keep the program up and running and address all the concerns that continue to come in. So what we've done is we've looked at a number of scenarios, and that funding gap that we're looking at is approximately $120,000. And so that's what we're looking at when we go into how to find some other revenue sources to keep this program going. So what we've done to fill that gap, to look at filling that gap, is staff, along with Councilmember Grant House, have met with the Rental Property Owners Association. We asked them if there was any way they could participate financially to help keep this program running. Unfortunately, they don't have the financial resources to do that, but we did get free ad space in their monthly publication, which was nice of them. We've also established a donation link on the Rental Housing Mediation Task Force website, so you can click on this link and donate to the program. I think it's 98% of the proceeds roughly go to the program, and that's helped administered by the Housing Authority, which is also very generous of them. We've also continued to write grants, whether it be CDBG grants to the city, CDBG grants to the county, and we've been successful in many of those areas. We've also received a grant from the Homeless Prevention and Rapid Rehousing Grant that's over the period of 3 years, with a small portion of that being able to, we can use that for administration purposes for the Rental Housing Mediation Task Force program. Our current grant to the county, or I should say application to the county for their CDBG, they are not recommending us for approval for this fiscal year, and that's $15,000 we were looking for from them. So we do continue to look at grant opportunities, and the one that would probably be of most interest to you folks today is that we continue to work on look at the establishment of an additional fee on the business license fee. And what we're looking at is putting this additional fee on property owners who own 3 or more rental units, and so it'd be on a unit-by-unit basis. And we've done some initial research, and this would happen when they come in to renew their business license fee. This fee would be added on. And our first phase of research shows that there are approximately 1,590 properties in the city limits with 3 or more rental units on them. And total units, we estimate it's about 13,000 units. So what we're trying to do here is, first, we're looking at the data that we've received so far. And again, this needs to be parceled out some more. We really need to get into significantly more detail. But of the 1,590 properties, what our initial research shows is that only approximately 650 of those have business licenses. And according to the city, you need to have, if you have 3 or more rental units, you need to have a business license. So there's roughly between 900 and 1,000 people or entities out there that do not have business licenses who are supposed to have business licenses. So kind of a side benefit of this is the business license program. If we can actually go out there and notice some of these people and they actually come in to get their business license, they would see a small increase in the business license fees that finance receives. In addition to that, there would be this additional fee tacked on a per unit basis that would then go to fund the Rental Housing and Mediation Task Force at a funding level, again, of 2 full-time and 1 to 2 part-time people. So we have a lot of work cut out for us, but I just wanted to give you a quick update on where we're at with that. As far as a per unit dollar amount, we're not quite sure. It could be in the range of $10 to $15. We need to really figure out how many units are out there and how many of these folks need to come in and get business licenses. So we'll continue along those lines, and we'll keep you updated. And again, our intent is to come back next fiscal year in the budget process if this is something that is palatable, and bring that before you at that particular time.
And Mr. Chair, just to be clear, that we feel we have the funding ability to maintain the current staffing level for another fiscal year. And so that's why we've got some time to keep working it out. And in some ways on the business license side, it's almost like the vacation TOT rental issue. It's a fee that we should be collecting, and maybe we haven't been following up as closely as we could. And so there's an opportunity just to get everyone on a fair playing ground. And then this fee issue is a consideration for us to consider as part of next year's budget.
Thank you. Public Works.
Okay, Chair Williams and members of the committee, Christine Anderson, Public Works Director. And we have a few slides that we want to walk through, and we'll be brief, but we appreciate the opportunity to give you a little heads up on what's been happening with our Streets Fund resource over the last couple of years, especially as we go into our budget presentation on Thursday for the department. This is a slide that shows the 14 primary sources of revenue going into streets funded programs that you've seen before in the capital improvement program. The grants are, generally speaking, funding that we can apply for or that is available for particular programs, generally for capital use. So it's the gas tax measure D/A and utility users tax that we're going to be focusing on for the next few moments. And this slide is a quick snapshot of the fiscal year 09 budgeted and actual, fiscal year 10 budgeted and projected year end, and our fiscal year 11 amended proposed revenue sources using gas tax measure D, which covers fiscal years 09 and 10, and then converts to measure A for fiscal year 11. UUT is just below that in the upper portion of the slide. And then down below is Prop 42 funding. Prop 42 is also a gas tax fund, but it has some different rules in terms of the delay of payment. So it's not quite as reliable in terms of when the funds are actually provided to the city, but they are based on a formula allocation, and so they are intended to be made available to the city at some point in time. And you can see in fiscal year 08 and 09 we had no payments. Received our payment in fiscal year 9. It's roughly around $700,000 to $750,000 a year. In fiscal year 10 projected We currently have had one payment and are anticipating that we'll get 2 quarterly payments in June 2010, and then we haven't heard what's projected for 2011 at this point. Just wanted to point out, as you look at the slide, in fiscal year 09 budgeted, we had a gas tax revenue that was anticipated to be approximately 1.8 million. Measure D revenues estimated at 4.9 million, and UUT funding at about 6.9 million. The total being 13.7 million roughly. Our actual receipts for that year were in total about $1,300,000 lower than what that budgeted estimate had been based on. And in Measure D funding for fiscal year 09, both budget and actual, and fiscal year 10, both budget and actual, there is a pass-through of MTD dollars that are included in those Measure D line items. They kind of work through without, the bottom line is still the reference point that we're looking at in terms of the impact to the city, because the Measure D is basically a pass-through that's pretty consistent through that couple of year period. And so what we're really looking at is in fiscal year 9, a lack of anticipated revenue of 1.3 million, and then in fiscal year 10, we had budgeted 13.7 million of the total of those categories. We actually are expecting to receive 12.2 million. That's $1,560,000 less than what had been anticipated when we were putting the budget together. And as you go into fiscal year 11, we've normalized, I believe, what those last 2 years of budgeted versus actual revenues look like, and we are budgeting 1.4 million in gas tax, which is more consistent with what we've seen in fiscal year 10 and fiscal year 09, even though the projections that we received from the state may have varied. In Measure A funding, the 2.79, we have adjusted that down. That's why this category is called an amended column. And we believe that those are reasonable in comparison to what we've been seeing with other sales tax revenues. So the difference between, and once again, the UUT was probably the closest, and that's the one number that we generate with our own staff. That's the city's UUT fund. The Measure D/A is a SBCAG, countywide sales tax measure, and of course gas tax is a statewide measure. So as you heard in Jill's previous report, the projection is a slight increase in the UUT for fiscal year 11. Looking at the projected year end for 10 and the fiscal year 11 amended, that differential of about $926,000 accounts for the pass-through for MTD. So what you're really looking at is almost a flattening of what we have for a projected year end for fiscal year 10 and what we expect to see going into 11. So we've accommodated for that variability over the last couple of years. Primarily, I'm going to show you what actually has been happening with the gas tax transfers, so you have a little bit of a understanding of the difficulty in doing some of these projections. This was for fiscal year 09-10, and it shows that the way the statutes read, the state can withhold the monthly payments. Normally these are set up as monthly payments to local agencies. They can be withheld by the state as long as they are transmitted within the fiscal year. So for cash flow purposes, the state has held back on the dispersion of those payments to local agencies in fiscal year 09-10. The July, August, and September payments were held until October, and the November, December, January, February, and March payments are being held until April. And the forecast for fiscal year 11 that we've been sent so far will take all of the payments that are anticipated in July, August, September, October, November, December, January, February, March, and we're projected to see those in April. So we won't have any of the monthly disbursements to be able to track and assure ourselves that we know what our revenues look like. And it will be a challenge going into fiscal year 11 to be managing our cash flow, understanding that we'll have one lump sum very close to the end of the fiscal year. So that's a little bit of the challenge we've been facing.
I have a question, if you
Yes.
don't mind. With Measure D and A, did you say that MTD pass-through is included in this amount or
Yes.
excluded?
It's included in the Measure D, which we received through fiscal year 09 and fiscal year 10, essentially. So we began collecting monies for Measure A April 1st, but we won't really be getting payments representing Measure A until fiscal year 11, and we're completing the disbursement of Measure D monies during this last quarter. So there's about 1.1 million in the transfers that the city pays through an MOU to MTD for services that they will now be receiving directly as a disbursement with Measure A.
Okay, so the projected or the amended would be
including those transfers. But as I said, for the fiscal year 09 and fiscal year 10 budgets, the transfer continues through those 4 columns, and so you're comparing apples to apples within that 4-column period. Looking at amended 11, that's where the MTD pass-through drops out.
Okay.
And that's what allocates the change between fiscal year 10 and fiscal year 11 actually being flat.
okay. Is there a
Can
percentage
Can
that?
we wait until the end of the presentation? Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
So just to mention the balancing that we've been doing with our the revenues not meeting expected levels has really hit the capital program for the most part. We've delayed projects, and we have been fortunate in having the ARA funding to help offset what the impact otherwise would have been to the capital program with this loss of approximately 1.4 million over the period of this 2-year cycle. So the next item that I wanted to bring to your attention is the maintenance of effort, and it was mentioned earlier in the meeting. So as you know, in November of 2008, Measure A was passed by the voters, and this enacted the ordinance that was adopted implementing road repair, traffic relief, and transportation safety measures that are intended to be funded through a 1.5 cent sales tax countywide, and that will be in effect for a 30-year period. As part of that ordinance, one of the sections included a requirement for a maintenance of effort, and the language in the ordinance may not be possible for you to read with this excerpt, but it's in your packet. And we've highlighted a couple of the key components. Fundamentally, the intent of the maintenance of effort was to maintain the level of local discretionary funding for street and road purposes that was in place at the time the election occurred, in order for the measure to actually be added funding for street and road funding purposes. And the base year that this was tied to is fiscal year 08. So annually, the City of Santa Barbara, as every other local agency, submits a state controller's report on the expenditures of funds relative to road and street uses. And that base year is the balancing act. And push the sheet up a bit. There you go. And the check to see that that maintenance of effort is being continued is hooked to the transfer of the agency's Measure A funding. So any local agency which does not meet its maintenance of effort requirement in a given fiscal year shall have its funding reduced in the following year by the amount by which the expenditure of the agency was less than the required level. So it's it is incumbent on the agencies within the county of Santa Barbara to be mindful of this because of the fact that the base year was chosen as '08, and obviously the economy has shifted in the last couple of years. There are several agencies within the SBCAG group that are really challenged by this requirement, and there is some continuing discussions taking place about how it can be implemented and not immediately impact the transfer of funds as they were intended to be allocated. So there's ongoing conversations that TTAC and SBCAG board will be having. But for the city's purposes and relative to the Measure G UUT funding, that is a significant portion of our maintenance of effort requirement. So it will be a direct impact to the transfer of Measure A funding if we were to make an adjustment to that allocation for street purposes. And I think that's the last slide. So we're ready for questions or anything that you have questions about that don't come to mind at the moment. I would just remind you that we will be meeting with council on Thursday morning with the department budget, and we will be following up with some of the impacts of how our need to address the reduction in street revenues will look. We are reducing some of the staff that are street-funded positions as part of that budget presentation.
So we will have several hours to ask more questions on Thursday, but is there any brief questions in the meantime? Councilmember Self?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Councilmember Francisco? Thank you. Then we're adjourned.